Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial on making your own TR-808 style toms. It is an absolutely classic percussion sound in electronic music, and I like using it as the bass line in melodious techno tracks such as this. I'm going to be using Phase Plant to build this patch, but if you use Serum, Vital, or really any other synthesizer, you should be able to follow along because the basis of this patch is just a resonating filter. But before we start building this, let's take a look at the Roland TR-808 schematic to figure out what we should be building. All right, let's break down this schematic so we can figure out how to model the analog circuits with components in our software synthesizers. So down here we have the pink noise generator with a volume envelope. That should be pretty easy to set up with our synthesizer. Over here we have a mixer, which is really just a level control. That's kind of built in for free in any synthesizer. But what's the most interesting part of this tom circuit is this T-bridge oscillator over here. And I've spent a lot of time talking about this oscillator in previous videos, so I won't go into so many details here. You can check out my previous videos if you want to see like circuit simulations with this and build intuition on how this circuit works and how you can kind of like figure out where it's resonating. But the gist of it is that even though this is an oscillator, it's actually, it's better to think of it as a resonating filter, and we're going to play this resonating filter as an oscillator. So what happens is that this trigger impulse comes over here. It's kind of a 10 millisecond burst of energy, and it causes this oscillator to resonate. And the resonant frequency, we can control the tuning with this variable resistor right here. And I think this is really cool because this is kind of like a real, it's almost like an analog model of how a physical drum works, where, the drummer strikes just like the trigger impulse. They strike the drum head, and then the drum kind of resonates at its natural frequency and naturally dissipates over time. And I think that's part of what gives these Roland circuits a real kind of natural physical sound. If we put all that information together, we can actually create a pretty realistic sounding TR-808 tom patch. But let's build this from scratch so that we can learn how each component works. So the first component we'll want to model is the trigger, which is a 1 millisecond pulse. So let's do that by setting the harmonic to 0, which puts this at like always DC, no matter what note you play. And then let's shift this by 500 hertz so that no matter where I play on the keyboard, we'll always get a 500 hertz square wave. And then what I want is just the first pulse of this square wave. So let's set our sustain to 0, our attack to 0, and our decay to something really short. And then our hold can be at 1 millisecond. This will give us a 1 millisecond pulse no matter where we play on the keyboard. And this is actually very similar to creating impulse. It's not a perfect impulse, but it's similar to an impulse, which I've talked about in my previous video on dispersion, or like 808 drums are like rainbows. So if you check that out, you can see where I talk about some of the maths, some of the DSP of how an impulse contains all frequencies. So you can see on my spectrogram up here in the top left, we're actually not getting all frequencies because it's not a perfect impulse, but it's a really broadband strike. It's kind of exciting almost all the frequencies. So the first thing I want to do is filter out everything below 20 hertz, since I don't ever want our resonating filter to kind of like carry any of that sub audio information and make our mix all wonky. Then the next thing I want to do is put in the resonating filter. So I'm going to use the nonlinear filter, which I found has given a really nice character to these kind of analog modeled patches. And the mid-tom of the TR-808 should be tuned somewhere around like 140 to like 170 hertz. And then what I actually want to do is, first off, I'm going to have a knob to control the Q. So let's call this the decay, because for a self-resonating filter, the more Q we have, or the higher the Q factor, the more resonance, or the longer our oscillator will ring out. And then I still don't really get quite enough resonance with one filter, so I'm going to stack this up and have two. So that's more like it. Then next, let's add a saturator with, that's in distortion, saturation, and then just add a little bit of drive, which will also just kind of clip the tops of our waveform out, make it a little more even. Okay, and to match the tone of the 808 a little better, we should also put a shelf filter in this circuit. And this is actually something I've noticed when I was simulating the circuit. The frequency response isn't exactly like a perfect high pass, and it kind of resembles having like a resonating high pass with this shelved higher frequencies around 1.2 kilohertz-ish with a gain of like -4, -5. So it does kind of tame our transient a little bit. And that is one thing I'll mention that makes this type of patch different than a patch we would make with like Kick 2, where you model this whole process with like a sine wave oscillator and an envelope, is this impulse actually does kind of bleed through. So we get that really clicky transient on this, which is part of why this type of patch has such like a clean or like punchy transient. All right, next let's add the pink noise in. I can do this in phase plant by turning this, or I guess the default is pink noise, so the slope is at 3 dB for octave. If you're in a different synthesizer with white noise, I think that means that there's a tilt filter. So there's a 3 dB per octave tilt filter, or you could just use white noise and get a slightly different tone. Just kind of my own taste. I didn't like all the bandwidth of the pink noise, so I kind of narrowed this down around the upper mid frequencies. So together, if we were to turn our tom off, and I'm going to send this to lane 2, this will essentially bypass the resonating filter for our white noise circuit. It sounds like this. Probably need to turn the gain way down. And without the filters, it sounds like this. So I'm just going to tame that a little bit. We can turn our resonating filter back on. And then it's just way too much. And again, I didn't actually simulate this part of the circuit, so I don't really know what the envelope should look like when I'm listening to 808 samples. I don't hear too much pink noise, so I'm guessing this was just a really tight envelope at the beginning. And it kind of makes that transient not so abrasive and clean, like just a really clicky thing you get from this impulse. Then the last thing is I just want to kind of saturate all these sounds together. So I think the first thing I'll do is just add some control to roll off the highs even more. So let's call this like a tone knob, and I will just allow us to low pass a little bit, depending on how much I want the transient to bleed through. And then I want to saturate everything together. And actually, more than saturate, I'm actually going to completely distort it. I like the sound of this fold back distortion. And once again, I am going to give a macro, because I know later on I'm going to want to control the drive of this circuit. Sorry, I keep calling it a circuit, this patch. So looking at my monitors for this patch, I don't like how much headroom this patch is taking for kind of how loud it is, or how much loudness it needs in the mix. So I kind of want to squash this a bit. And the distortion adds too many harmonics, so I'm actually going to use dynamics, which is like a compressor slash expander. And let's just dial this in a little bit. And yeah, I just kind of like the squashed waveform a little better for mixing reasons. Okay, so the last part of this patch we should model is the tuning. So I showed you in the TR-808 circuit, they had a potentiometer, or like this variable resistor where you twist a knob to choose what's the resonating frequency of the filters. And you can change the pitch that way. And I think that there is something kind of nice about choosing the pitch with a knob. It kind of gets you out of your head, like you're not thinking of what note it is, you're kind of just twisting it until it sounds nice with the song. So, you know, like we could totally set that up. And that's still probably a larger range than the 808, but you get the point. You can kind of play this around with your song, and like, I don't know, let's just play the demo track. Yeah, so I don't even know what note that is. I mean, you could look over here. That's a D, but there is kind of something nice about doing it the Roland way, where you kind of twist this knob and you're not thinking so much about what note it is. But I'm going to show you one other trick where we can use our keyboard to play this so that it's more like playing a real instrument. So to play this with our keyboard, I'm first going to turn this macro off. And then what we want to do is these oscillators should be set to 440 hertz. And this is specific to phase plant. If you're using a different synthesizer, just look up how to key track the filter and your synthesizer of choice. So yeah, I'm pretty much just going to map this note modulator to the cutoff, and it should modulate 100%, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And now I'm playing an F, so that looks right because I'm playing an F on my keyboard. So now that we've set up key tracking, we can play our instrument with our keyboard and dial in a melody that way. So let's just play around and see if we can come up with something. Yeah, so you could probably chop that up and come up with a cool little loop. All right, the last trick I am going to share is dropping Redux on toms can be really nice. I think especially for like techno style tracks. I think this is just sample rate reduction. If you don't use Ableton, you can probably find some free distortion plugin out there that does sample rate reduction. And if you look at the spectral envelope over here in the top right, you can see it's adding a lot of high frequency content. So I think like depending on which speakers you're on, the Redux can add some clarity to the toms if the speakers aren't kind of producing that, you know, that sub 250 hertz region with that much fidelity. This can kind of, you know, brighten up your toms quite a bit, although it does significantly change the sound, so you kind of have to decide if this effect would serve your song. But this also brings up another point I wanted to talk about, which is kind of with this key tracked approach, having all your toms output essentially on one channel. You can only process each tom like as a group. I mean, you don't have to. You could, you know, duplicate this tom track several times and like, you know, only have one note on each track. which, that's, if that's how you want to do it, that's fine. But I just wanted to show that kind of in this initial method, I show that's more like how the 808 does it, where you tune it with this knob. That I think has some benefits, or at least kind of having separate tracks for your different tom instruments has some benefits because you can process them separately. And like with these toms, I think it sounds really cool where we can control different amounts of redux for the low tom doesn't have any, the mid has tuned at 6 kilohertz, and the high has it tuned at a different frequency. I think that sounds a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more movement that you kind of don't have the static redux over all the toms. It's like each tom has its own character, and that serves the song, I think. So that's all I had for you today. If you want to see more content like this, follow along with the channel, and I'll see you next time. I'm just going to play out this track to close out the video.